This investigation is sponsored by Endel. The Stargate Project was a top-secret US military program that experimented with psychic spies for, well, seeing across space and time, a rather useful capability during the Cold War and other international conflicts, as you might imagine. But you already knew that, unless you're watching this video before part 1, and if that's the case, I won't judge. So, where did we leave off? Well, it's 1975 and the CIA had become mostly convinced of the reality of psychic powers, and particularly remote viewing, the ability to use the mind's eye alone to observe and acquire direct information of locations, objects, and events blocked from ordinary means of perception. Operating at Stanford Research Institute, Stargate's two main scientists, Dr. Hal Pitoff and Russell Targ, found a former police commissioner named Pat Price. And for the CIA, Price remote viewed a Soviet nuclear research center, two foreign embassies, and a Libyan missile training site, providing virtually irrefutable evidence of psychic functioning, and most importantly, its practical use in military and intelligence gathering operations. And for Pitoff and Targ, he unwittingly brought them to realize that remote viewing not only penetrates through geographical distance, but also the dimension of time. Pat Price's sudden death in 1975 left the CIA with many burning questions, but due to internal politicking, the project was passed to various other government entities like Hot Potato. Not many wanted to have their name linked to Stargate due to the taboo nature of the project. However, the reality of remote viewing never ceased to be apparent. And once it landed in the hands of the US Army Intelligence and Security Command, or INSCOM, a few higher-ups recognized the potential and made significant efforts to do what the CIA before them had failed to achieve. If remote viewing was real, it was time to put it into action, with a unit of trained psychic soldiers and a number of military missions that would ultimately reach the office of the US president. But if all that was so successful, and the reality of remote viewing was effectively proven beyond a doubt, why did the CIA shut down the program? What exactly did they find? So, that's today's story, and the adventures of these psychic spies might just blow your mind. All my sources have been carefully vetted, and you'll find a link to them in the description. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange, ancient, and in this case, top secret scientific mysteries with research so deep, you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask that you give this video a like and ding the notifications bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every video. Before we dive in though, you might know that the Stargate Project wasn't only focused on remote viewing. Among other psychic and psychological phenomena, one thing that really captured their attention was the effect of audio waveforms on the human brain. As seen in their now infamous declassified report, Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process, which I promise I'll cover in a future video. But right now, I want to make it clear that the powerful effects audio can have on our brain are well studied and scientifically accepted, and today's sponsor, Endel, is a non-profit app that takes everything we know about sound and uses artificial intelligence to help you relax, energize, focus, and more. Their patented technology personalizes the soundscape in real time, adapting to what's going on in and around you. Since I've been pretty into this Stargate stuff, I decided to make Endel an essential part of my workflow, so while working on these two videos, I've had my headphones playing Endel, and let me tell you, I usually deal with serious brain fog and distraction, but Endel's been an actual game changer. It's pretty obvious to me how much better I've been working, but don't just take my word for it. Endel's effectiveness is backed by neuroscience. A 2021 study found that their engineered soundscape resulted in a 7 times increase in focus, and that focus was maintained for 95% of the time spent listening. These results were further validated in a peer-reviewed research paper in 2022. But more than just focus, Endel has soundscapes for almost any activity. So if you feel you could use a boost in energy, a shot of motivation, or possibly the world's coolest sleep soundscape and wake-up alarm, definitely take advantage of this offer. The first 100 of you to download Endel using my link in the description will get a free week of audio experiences. Thanks again to Endel, let's jump right into part 2 of our investigation of the Stargate Project and discover the true potential of the human mind. The Stargate Project had many phases and a history well worth exploring, and take it from me, understanding its evolution is the only way to truly unlock the answers to the mysteries it left us with. But the fact remains that it's pretty convoluted, with the only constant throughout its 23 years being the continued evidence that remote viewing actually works. Well, sometimes. Because of this constant mix of indisputable success and blatant failure, often occurring in the same viewing, the Stargate Project would be passed back and forth through an alphabet soup of different departments and agencies, with 8 or so uniquely codenamed iterations. So, Stargate itself was very much alive and well, despite the CIA terminating their involvement in the project. Temporarily, of course, as they didn't know they'd eventually be dragged back in. Perhaps the best way to explain its evolution is from a now declassified presentation from 1986 given by the Defense Intelligence Agency and regarding Project Sunstreak, which was the last iteration before the project finally became Stargate. For this, I'll be narrating the speaker's actual transcripts along with the original presentation slides. By the way, don't worry if you get confused at any point. The government loves to make things complicated, but I hope this will give you a bit of insight on how they treated the project internally. So, without further ado, quote, "Good afternoon. I would like to present a brief overview of the Project Sunstreak, giving a few points on its historical background and explanations of what is accomplished by our project. This briefing and the information it contains is classified secret, special access information. Since the early 1970s, the Department of Defense, DoD, has been involved in examining potential uses of psychoenergetics. Experiments using remote viewing as an intelligence gathering tool conducted by 2 laser physicists, Hal Pitoff and Russell Targ at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, proved successful. Using several apparently gifted psychic subjects, the most notable of whom were Pat Price and Ingo Swann, SRI scientists conducted several CIA-sponsored remote viewing tests. Psychic impressions included much detailed, accurate information, some of which was previously unreported, about redacted. The psychic impressions were confirmed by Hummant and national technical sources. As a result of these original tests, emphasis on the last decade has centered on remote viewing, rather than on other aspects of parapsychology, such as mental telepathy, ESP, or psychokinesis. In 1977, the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM, established a project team under the Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Human Intelligence and implemented the Gondola Wish program. Project Gondola Wish, purpose: to integrate the Soviet and Eastern psychoenergetic intelligence collection threat into the All-Source Operations OPSEC support scenario. Location: Fort Meade, Maryland. By 1978, the Army Technical Intelligence Field Agency concluded that there was sufficient evidence to warrant the development of a comprehensive program to explore intelligence collection applications of psychoenergetics. The Army canceled the Gondola Wish effort, placed a complete security envelope over the Army's interest in psychoenergetics, and implemented a new program directed toward intelligence collection using remote viewing. Project Grow Flame, purpose: to use remote viewing as a collection method. Location: Fort Meade, Maryland. The next concern, however, was whether or not information obtained from remote viewing would be of reasonable accuracy. Even if so, would the information be accepted and used by the intelligence community? On the 4th of September 1979, the Army Technical Intelligence Field Agency tasked INSCOM to locate a missing Navy aircraft. Hence, the first INSCOM Grow Flame operational remote viewing session took place. In this initial session, the remote viewer located the missing aircraft within 15 miles of where it had crashed. End quote. Now, hold on, let's pause the presentation for a second because it would be criminal not to mention the odd and enduring connection between psychics and airplanes. The history of psychics being recruited to locate missing aircrafts is a long one, but maybe for a good reason, because there's also a history of remote viewers finding them. As we just heard, in 1979, a viewer pinpointed a Navy aircraft 15 miles from its downed location, but that success is far from the only one in Stargate's resume. According to the quintessential 1977 book, Remote Viewers: The Secret History of America's Psychic Spies, by the science writer Jim Schnabel, who interviewed some pretty high-ranking members of Stargate, Ken Bell of the Fort Meade unit successfully located 2 crash sites. For the first, he remote viewed a small mountain in Virginia, even giving the exact name of the mountain, which was called Bald Knob. In the second instance, he pinpointed a location high in the Peruvian Andes where the burned wreckage of an American helicopter and its deceased crew were later found. However, Stargate's most famous lost aircraft find occurred in 1976 at SRI. The viewer was a young woman named Rosemary Smith, and her target was a Soviet Tu-22 bomber that had been outfitted as a spy plane. The only thing she was told was that it crashed somewhere in the jungle of the Central African Republic. By that point, the CIA and the Department of Defense had oriented a number of spy satellites in order to attempt to find the plane themselves, with no luck. So the head of the CIA, Admiral Stansfield Turner, personally reached out to SRI for help. This particular story became so famous because the former US President Jimmy Carter, who was president during the events, came out on record after the declassification of Stargate, speaking about what happened. As recorded in CNN's archives, President Carter stated that Rosemary Smith, quote, went into a trance and gave some latitude and longitude figures. We focused our satellite cameras on that point and the plane was there, end quote. Those were the president's words as recorded by CNN in 1995. Alright, so where were we? It's 1979 and the very first operational remote viewing of Project Girl Flame was a massive success. The missing Navy aircraft was found. Now, back to the presentation. Quote, based on these results, INSCOM was tasked to work against additional operational targets. These taskings forced a premature halt to the initial training phases, and by December of 1979, the project was committed to operations. Cooperation was formalized among active Girl Flame players, other than the DIA and INSCOM. These included the Secretary of the Army, Army General Counsel, Assistant Surgeon General for Medical R&D, Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, NSA, CIA, Navy, and Redacted. INSCOM terminated formal involvement with Girl Flame at the end of 1982, but maintained its momentum of effort by the direction of the Commanding General under a special access program called Center Lane, funded with monies from the Air Force Security and Investigative Activities programs. On the 19th of October, 1983, DIA published the results of their 3-year psychoenergetics evaluation effort. There were several key recommendations that resulted from the 3-year Girl Flame effort, as shown here. These findings and recommendations were supported by an independent science review panel. Basic research in both remote viewing and remote action phenomena should be initiated. Applied intelligence applications research in remote viewing should be continued and should be under the overall management of DIA. By February 1985, the initial steps were underway to transfer Center Lane to DIA as a DoD Special Access Program. The DoD and DIA psychoenergetic collection effort is now called Sunstreak, and the mission of Sunstreak is shown here. Purpose: to undertake operational intelligence applications using an aspect of psychoenergetics known as remote viewing. Project Sunstreak facilities and activities are located in Fort Meade, Maryland, approximately halfway between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. An integral part of the mission of Sunstreak involves training professional intelligence personnel to remote view. Training developed from the practical application of state-of-the-art psychoenergetic technology drawn from academic institutions, scientific laboratories, and research establishments around the world. In the 1970s, the consensus was that the remote viewing process seemed to be facilitated by physical relaxation and enhanced internal attention. Remote viewing is a highly controlled and formally established, unique intelligence collection capability which has the following characteristics. It is passive. To the extent of our knowledge, collection by remote viewing is totally passive. That is to say, it cannot be detected when used. Only one scientific claim of detection of remote viewing is known. Chinese scientists claim to have detected remote viewing during their experiments with children. Data on these experiments is insufficient to validate their claim. Remote viewing is inexpensive. The principal cost of remote viewing collection is the people involved. There is little expensive hardware since, for the most part, the people themselves are the equipment. Remote viewing has no known defense. Time, distance, target, size, or degree of difficulty all have no apparent effect on collection by remote viewing. Even conceptualized plans have been collected prior to their actual implementation. Remote viewing has been successfully used against 7 categories of tasking: penetration of inaccessible targets, science and technology information, queuing of other intelligence collection systems, imminent hostilities, determination of nuclear from non-nuclear targets, human source assessments, and accurate personality profiles. 2 of these categories, penetration of inaccessible targets and the queuing of other intelligence collection systems, are used predominantly at this time. This has been a brief overview of Project Sunstreak, a psychoenergetics program under the auspices of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Let me caution you again that the information contained in this briefing has been classified secret and is compartmented special access information. End quote. At the time of this presentation, 1986, Stargate had expanded significantly since the days of Pat Price. There were now 2 main locations: Stanford Research Institute, SRI, and Fort Meade, Maryland. These were 2 very different worlds. One leaned more toward scientific inquiry, and the other toward more practical military operations. While SRI definitely had their fair share of missions, they were more geared toward running statistical experiments in stark white rooms filled to the brim with high-tech equipment. The unit at Fort Meade, however, was another story. According to a 1995 Washington Post interview with Fort Meade's first and possibly most gifted psychic soldier, remote viewer 001, aka Joseph McMoneagle, quote, McMoneagle reported to an old, leaky wooden barracks at Fort Meade where he went into a one-person office. He sat at a desk with a typewriter and a mug of coffee. He was then presented with sealed envelopes, sometimes large brown ones, sometimes small white ones, and he was asked to supply information about whatever was inside. End quote. The unit at Fort Meade would be assigned missions where all other agencies' approaches and attempts had failed. They were composed of around 15 remote viewers, but we're just going to focus on one, Joseph McMoneagle. The reason for this is because it's incredibly rare to find any official CIA records of Stargate's remote viewings after the era of Pat Price, because most of them were covert operations. So almost all of these documents are still classified to this day, which made my job a bit difficult, as my goal is to only use the most high-quality sources. As noted by Dr. Hal Patoff in his 1996 paper, quote, as the program expanded, in only a very few cases, Could the client's identities and program tasking be revealed? For essentially all other projects during my 14-year tenure, the identity of the clients and most of the tasking were classified and remain so today. Even though the details of the broad range of experiments, some with brilliant successes, many total failures, have not yet been released, we have nonetheless been able to publish summaries." End quote. I'd be lying if I didn't admit these summaries and stories retold mainly by the remote viewers themselves are undeniably interesting. For example, the remote viewer Angela Ford apparently tracked down the fugitive drug smuggler Charlie Jordan in 1989, leading to his arrest. And in 1980, the viewer Keith Harari assisted in getting the hostage Richard Queen released by Iranian militants, remote viewing his deteriorating health condition caused by multiple sclerosis. While I still think they happen in some form, honestly, most retellings of them seem a bit exaggerated and I can't back up the actual details. The story is different though when it comes to remote viewer 001, aka Joseph McMoneagle, and the reason why we'll be focusing on him is twofold. First off, as a primary source, McMoneagle has been vouched for by many of his colleagues as extremely accurate and truthful to the events. In 2002, he released a lengthy memoir titled The Stargate Chronicles, Memoirs of a Psychic Spy, which honestly deserves far more attention, so I'm leaving a link to it down below. Among others, the Stargate Chronicles has been endorsed by Dr. Edwin May, the final program director of the Stargate Project. The second reason, though, is simple. Joseph McMoneagle was one of Stargate's most gifted and important remote viewers, easily rivaling Pat Price and Ingo Swann. Since his retirement, he's performed over 95 live televised remote viewing demonstrations, and Dr. May famously boasted that he could present McMoneagle with 5 options, and he would pick the right one just under 50% of the time. It's safe to say that this man was an effective remote viewer, but his importance at Fort Meade can't be understated. According to 2 declassified CIA documents, Dr. May described him as, quote, "the primary source for the Meade activity from its inception in 1979 until his retirement in 1984. He is excellent at his craft and is responsible for most of Fort Meade's successful applications." End quote. Joseph McMoneagle got his nickname Remote Viewer 001 because he was the first remote viewer to work directly for the Pentagon, first signing on to the project in 1978. Before he joined, he'd previously held a successful 20-year career in the military as a chief warrant officer until he suffered a severe injury in a helicopter accident during the Vietnam War. Speaking of which, it was actually in Vietnam where McMoneagle claims he mastered his psychic abilities, particularly precognition, as a soldier avoiding deadly attacks from the Viet Cong enemy. However, his story goes all the way back to his childhood. In interviews, he's emphasized his unusually vivid memory of very early events in his life. Sadly, McMoneagle grew up in a very poor and abusive household with alcoholic parents. He remembers sharing thoughts and feelings telepathically with his twin sister, Margaret, who he described as also highly psychically gifted. It was a way for them to communicate safely. He also recalled that his psychic gift protected him as he hitchhiked from place to place during his teenage years. Quote, "I caught rides from total strangers, sometimes after dark and always in the worst possible parts of town. That's probably where I first started to hone my psychic abilities." End quote. In his 5 years remote viewing at Fort Meade, Joe McMoneagle states that he participated in around 450 missions. These included locating hostages in Iran, directly aiding a hostage release in Italy, spying on a Chinese nuclear lab, remote viewing the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, locating a downed Soviet bomber that was carrying nuclear materials, and observing the previously unknown construction of the world's largest submarine, later named the Typhoon class, and accurately predicting that the Soviets would transport it from the warehouse to the open ocean 4 months later in mid-January of 1980. We'll talk more on his precognitive abilities soon, by the way. According to his 1995 interview with the Washington Post, one of his favorite missions was, quote, in 1980, when CIA personnel captured a suspected KGB agent in South Africa. They wanted to know how the agent was communicating with the Soviet military. They put an envelope on McMonagle's desk, and without knowing anything of the man, McMonagle told the CIA that the man liked to use a small pocket calculator. The calculator turned out to be a disguised shortwave radio. End quote. It's a fact that McMonagle provided true operational value through remote viewing, because the US Army awarded him one of the highest military decorations, the Legion of Merit, upon his retirement from Stargate, quote, for providing information of critical value, unobtainable from any other source, on over 200 specific targets, end quote. Despite his obvious success with remote viewing, it seems Joe McMonagle's most underrated power was that of precognition, the carefully honed ability that kept him safe as a hitchhiker and kept him alive in Vietnam. Precognition would also set him leagues apart from other remote viewers in the Stargate Project, and one of the more odd instances of this revolved around the first space station, Skylab. As recounted in McMonagle's memoir, The Stargate Chronicles, quote, in 1978, we got word that sometime in the next year, the American Skylab was expected to fall from orbit and break up. In a conversation I had with Hal Patoff while I was out in California, he had said one of the best ways to prove remote viewing would be to do a target for which there was not yet an answer. In this case, no one on the planet knew where or when Skylab was going to drop out of orbit and hit the Earth. I wrote out on a small card, which I slipped under the glass of my desk, when and where is the American Skylab going to re-enter the atmosphere? Scotty Watt, one of Fort Meade's lead intelligence officers, thought it was a target that couldn't be answered, because it had not yet happened. After working on the problem at my desk for a couple days, I decided the issue was more complex than it appeared. It wasn't a simple answer like, here and when, but eventually I produced a map that I gave to Scotty, and also forwarded to Hal Patoff at SRI. I had selected a spot in Australia about 2/3 of the way west, across from the easternmost coast and about a third of the way up from the southern coast, and drew in a pear-shaped area running from the narrow end westward to a much larger end. I darkened in the narrow end and said that was where the primary craft pieces would impact, with the larger end being the debris field that would spread over about 1,500 miles of area, some 60 miles wide. It was the latter part of 1978. I predicted that re-entry would occur around the 5th of July, 1979. Skylab re-entered from Earth orbit on the 11th of July, 1979. I missed the primary impact area by approximately 60 kilometers, as the area I selected was a bit farther to the north. I also missed the re-entry date by 6 days and a few hours and minutes. I was disappointed that my results were almost ignored. Scotty never said a word to me about it, but the next time I saw Hal, a few years later, he said that it was one of the most impressive predictions he had ever seen. I think the problem within the unit was that we had so much operational tasking to worry about that they did whatever they could to discourage us from freelance-type viewing. I could understand that, but still, it would have been nice to have someone notice that my Skylab stuff had been both precognitive and accurate. End quote. So, I actually did find documentation of McMonagle's predictions as well as the map he drew for Hal Patoff and Scotty Watt. It's located in the archives of the Woodson Research Center of Rice University in Houston, Texas, box 21, folder 15. I paid Woodson for a scan, but unfortunately they weren't able to send it to me in time for this video. When I do get it though, you all will definitely be the first to see it. Assuming that the details in McMonagle's book match the ones in the archive documentation, that's extremely strong proof that remote viewers can see into the future. Regardless, there's little reason to doubt his account of this event. In the 1995 CIA evaluation, the statistician Dr. Jessica Utz asserted that, quote, precognition in which the relevant information is known to no one until a future time appears to work quite well. Recent experiments suggest that if there is a psychic sense, it works very much like our other five senses do, by detecting change. Physicists are currently grappling with an understanding of time, and it may be that a psychic sense scans the future for major change, such as our eyes scan the environment for visual change, or our ears allow us to respond to sudden changes in sound. That idea is consistent with anecdotal reports of precognition, which are generally concerned with events involving major life change. Laboratory remote viewing may in part work by someone directing the viewer to focus on a particular point in the future, that in which he or she receives the feedback from the experiment. It may also be the case that this same sense can scan the environment in actual time and detect change as well. End quote. What's wild is that instances of accidental precognition in remote viewing are so common that some parapsychologists theorize that all instances of remote viewing might actually be precognition, where the viewer accesses a point in the future where the correct answer or experiment feedback is given to them, and they subconsciously communicate this information with themselves across time. A pretty interesting theory if you ask me. Regardless, if precognition is possible, which the statistical evaluation of the Stargate Project suggests it is, this has some pretty deep philosophical implications. The mere existence of precognition brings up fundamental questions of free will, causality, and determinism. Determinism is the idea that all events are determined entirely by cause and effect. So if pre-existing causes determine every aspect of our present, including where, who, and what we are, in that case, we're essentially bound to cause and effect, and thus we technically have no free will. All choices are merely a subjective illusion, and even you watching this very video was determined before you were even born. So, if you're feeling a bit of existential discomfort with that, don't worry too much. Some philosophers argue that free will can still exist in a deterministic universe without being a logical paradox, and if you want to read into that, it's called compatibilism, and honestly, it gives me a bit of a headache to think about. But speaking of determinism, the overly complicated history of the Stargate Project would continue, and every step of the way, Stargate would inch closer to its fate. In 1982, Russell Targ left SRI to form a private company called Delphi Associates with the former Stargate remote viewer Keith Harari. Delphi was a psychic investment consulting service where they attempted to remote view the movement of the financial markets. And according to Targ and Harari's 1984 book, The Mind Race, all 9 silver futures predictions that they made in 1982 were correct. In 1985, Hal Pitoff would also leave SRI to form his own private company called EarthTech International, as well as a research organization known as the Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin. In 1991, they merged, and unlike Delphi, EarthTech is still around today, and their website states that they perform research on, among other things, theories of space-time, studies of the quantum vacuum, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Clearly, both Pitoff and Targ were profoundly inspired by what they learned at Stargate, and both remain absolute believers in the remote viewing phenomenon to this day, which should be no surprise. With Dr. Pitoff's departure from Stargate, the position of SRI Program Director was passed to his longtime colleague, the nuclear physicist Dr. Edwin May. Dr. May had actually joined the team all the way back in 1976 by Pitoff's personal invitation, and After becoming program director in 1985, he would serve this position until the final cancellation of the project. There's no doubt that May was just as passionate as Pitoff and Targ, if not perhaps more, considering the fact that he still performs scientific remote viewing research to this day, and gets pissed the hell off when skeptics dismiss remote viewing without considering the evidence, as observed in a 2015 Newsweek interview. Quote, "I'm not going to deal with a skeptic who has no f***ing idea about what he's talking about, because he's just making it up. That's bad science. I'm a scientist." End quote. Indeed, Dr. May was the real deal. In 1991, the CIA passed the program to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, who then reassigned the research contract from Stanford Research Institute to another research institution, known as the Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC, whose office was located in the same city, Menlo Park, California. With the move to SAIC, Dr. May went through great lengths to completely eliminate any methodological flaws that were present in the previous experiments at SRI. From ensuring true randomization of targets to improving the objectiveness of judging, he was absolutely determined to make the study of remote viewing as scientific as possible. This grand switch also gave the project, then named Sunstreak, its final code name, Stargate. The end of days was nearing. In 1995, the Defense Appropriations Bill saw oversight of the Stargate Project transferred back from the DIA to the CIA, and the CIA decided that it was time to put the results of this mammoth endeavor to the final test. It had been 23 years. Had the research proven without a doubt that remote viewing was a real ability? And most importantly, would it be useful for intelligence gathering purposes? The CIA commissioned a comprehensive evaluation from the American Institutes for Research, a non-profit private research organization, who then assembled a team of 2 blue ribbon experts, 2 senior behavioral scientists, 1 independent consultant, and the president of the institute itself. Dr. Edwin May compiled the wealth of experimental data and handed it over. Judgment Day was upon them. For this section, I'll be quoting extensively from the 183-page report titled An Evaluation of Remote Viewing, Research and Applications. After years of Stargate leaks and intensifying speculation among the American people, this document, published on September 29, 1995, was the CIA's first public admission that the US had been employing full-time psychic spies for intelligence gathering and military operations for well over 2 decades. Here, I'll be going over the core arguments made by the 2 blue ribbon experts, who assumed the respective roles of arguing for and against. I'll also be going over the most notable findings and finally the ultimate conclusion reached by the review panel. These quotes are going to be quite long, but they're extremely interesting, and after you hear them, you're finally going to get a grip on the full picture. To begin, we need to understand the evaluation method and meet our 2 experts. Quote, "To evaluate the research program, a blue ribbon panel was assembled. The panel included 2 noted experts in the area of parapsychology, Dr. Jessica Utz, a professor of statistics at the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Raymond Hyman, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. In addition to their extensive credentials, they were selected to represent both sides of the paranormal controversy. Dr. Utz has published articles that view paranormal interpretations positively, while Dr. Hyman was selected to represent a more skeptical position. Both, however, are viewed as fair and open-minded scientists. Panel members were asked to review all laboratory experiments and meta-analytic reviews conducted as part of the research program. Separate reviews were prepared by Dr. Utz and Dr. Hyman. They exchanged reviews with other panel members, who then tried to reach a consensus. End quote. So, it seems to be a fair game, a proponent of psychic phenomena and a harsh skeptic, both of whom are recognized and respected experts. And after reading the entire document, honestly, I believe both of them make excellent and valid points that we should be paying attention to. So, without spoiling what's ahead, let's jump right into review number 1, titled An Assessment of the Evidence for Psychic Functioning by Dr. Jessica Utz, September 1st, 1995. The following is in the words of Dr. Utz. Quote, according to Webster's dictionary, in law, prima facie evidence is evidence having such a degree of probability that it must prevail unless the contrary be proved. There are a few examples of applied non-laboratory remote viewings provided to the review team that would seem to meet the criterion for evidence. These are examples in which the sponsor or another government client asked for a single remote viewing of a site known to the requester in real time or in the future, and the viewer provided details far beyond what could be taken as a reasonable guess. An example is given in which a remote viewer allegedly gave code words from a secret facility that he should not have even known existed. Even if we can't assign an exact probability to the fact that he guessed them correctly, we can agree that it would be very small. That would seem to constitute prima facie evidence, unless an alternative explanation could be found. Similarly, the viewer who described the microwave generator allegedly knew only that the target was a technical site in the United States. Yet he drew and described the microwave generator, including its function, its approximate size, how it was housed, and that it had a beam divergence angle of 30 degrees. End quote. Dr. Utz then goes on to talk at length of how success in remote viewing has been evaluated by government officials, and why so many experiments were unfairly labeled as failures, which unfortunately caused continuous setbacks throughout the project's history. Quote, for example, a government official who reviewed the Semipalatinsk work concluded that there was no way the remote viewer could have drawn the large gantry crane unless he actually saw it through remote viewing, or he was informed of what to draw by someone knowledgeable of the site. Yet that same analyst concluded that the remote viewing of the site by subject S1 proved to be unsuccessful because the only positive evidence of the rail-mounted gantry crane was far outweighed by the large amount of negative evidence noted in the body of this analysis. In other words, the analyst had the expectation that in order to be successful, a remote viewing should contain accurate information only. End quote. If you were to read the Wikipedia article on the Stargate Project, or pretty much any other short-form article on the subject, you'll notice that there's an overwhelming amount of focus on Stargate's apparently bad methodology. But what does the data say? Quote, in 1988, an analysis was made of all the experiments conducted at SRI from 1973 until that time. The analysis was based on all 154 experiments conducted during that era, consisting of over 26,000 individual trials. Of those, almost 20,000 were of the forced choice type, and just over 1,000 were laboratory remote viewings. There were a total of 227 subjects in all experiments. The statistical results were so overwhelming that results that extreme, or more so, would occur only about once in every 10 to the 20th power such instances, a probability of 1 in over 10 quintillion, if chance alone is the explanation. Obviously, some explanation other than chance must be found. Psychic functioning may not be the only possibility, especially since some of the earlier work contained methodological problems. However, the fact that the same level of functioning continued to hold in the later experiments, which did not contain those flaws, lends support to the idea that the methodological problems cannot account for the results. In fact, there was a talented group of subjects for whom the effects were stronger than for the group at large. There was a group of 6 selected individuals whose performance far exceeded that of unselected subjects. The fact that these same selected individuals consistently performed better than others under a variety of protocols provides a type of replicability that helps substantiate the validity of the results. If methodological problems were responsible for the results, they should not have affected this group differently from others." End quote. Here, Utz introduced one of the key findings of the Stargate Project, that the data strongly suggests that only certain people are gifted with the ability to remote view, at least effectively. Quote, "Mass screening efforts found that about 1% of those who volunteered to be tested were consistently successful at remote viewing. This indicates that remote viewing is an ability that differs across individuals, much like athletic ability or musical talent. Neither practice nor a variety of training techniques consistently work to improve remote viewing ability. It seems that it is easier to find than to train good remote viewers. It also appears to be the case that certain individuals are better at some tasks than others. For example, viewer 372 at SAIC appears to have a facility at describing technical sites." End quote. This was just one of several other statistical conclusions she came to, the most important others being, quote, "Free response remote viewing, in which subjects describe a target, was much more successful than forced choice experiments, in which subjects were asked to choose from a small set of possibilities. Distance between the target and the subject does not seem to impact the quality of remote viewing. Electromagnetic shielding does not appear to inhibit performance. There is compelling evidence that precognition, in which the target is selected after the subject has given the description, is also successful." End quote. We already discussed precognition earlier, and the second and third points are obvious, so let's talk about the first point, that free response remote viewing, the technique we've been focusing on for these 2 videos, is significantly more successful than forced choice, which is when a subject picks 1 out of 5 options. You'd think it would be easier to be right when there's a guaranteed answer among 5 options, as opposed to coming up with an answer from nothing. But tell me, what sounds more engaging and inspiring? A multiple choice test or a real-life spying mission? This observation again emphasizes the idea that remote viewing is a talent more than a learned skill. Most talents really only come out or shine when the person is inspired, like an actor in a movie that truly embraces their role, and you can tell that there's just something about their performance that's incredible and in a league above the others. So it's really no surprise that the more interesting the task, the better the remote viewing will be. Dr. Utz's final argument centers around whether the results of Stargate are replicable, and confronts the issue that Stargate, at that point, had been the only rigorously scientific study of remote viewing conducted. Quote, "One of the most important hallmarks of science is replicability, a phenomenon with statistical variability, whether it is scoring home runs in baseball, curing a disease with chemotherapy, or observing psychic functioning, should exhibit the same level of success in the long run over repeated experiments of a similar nature. The remote viewing experiments are no exception. Methodologically sound remote viewing has not been undertaken at other laboratories, but a similar regime called the Ganzfeld has shown to be similarly successful. The Ganzfeld experiments differ from remote viewing in 3 fundamental ways. First, a mild altered state is used. Second, senders are usually used, so that telepathy is the primary mode. And third, the receivers, or viewers, do their own judging just after the session, rather than having an independent judge. In publishing the Ganzfeld results from psychophysical research laboratories, Bem and Honorton's 1994 studies showed 106 hits out of 329 sessions, for a hit rate of 32.2%, when 25% was expected by chance. Bierman in 1995 reported 4 series of experiments conducted at the University of Amsterdam. Overall, there were 124 sessions and 46 hits, for a hit rate of 37%. Morris, Dalton, Delanoy, and Watt in 1995 reported results of 97 sessions conducted at the University of Edinburgh, in which there were 32 successes, for a hit rate of 33%. Broughton and Alexander in 1995 reported results from 100 sessions at the Institute for Parapsychology in North Carolina. They too found a similar hit rate, with 33 hits out of 100 sessions, or 33% hits. End quote. We'll be discussing telepathy in a later episode, so I won't get too into the Gonsfeld experiments right now. Because the Gonsfeld experiments are not technically remote viewing, both Dr. Utz and her opponent, Dr. Hyman, are insistent that more remote viewing studies need to be conducted. And this is actually one of their major points of agreement, but for different reasons. While Hyman insisted that more investigation would be necessary to prove the existence of paranormal functioning, Utz was convinced by the Stargate data that proof of psychic ability had been established, and that focus should no longer be on demonstrating remote viewing's existence, but experimenting to figure out how it actually works and advancing the techniques to perform it. I believe the abstract of Dr. Utz's paper sums up her ultimate conclusion elegantly. Quote, "Using these standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Arguments that these results could be due to methodological flaws in the experiments are soundly refuted. Such consistency cannot be readily explained by claims of flaws or fraud. The magnitude of psychic functioning exhibited appears to be in the range between what social scientists call a small and a medium effect. It is thus reliable enough to be replicated in properly conducted experiments. It is recommended that future experiments focus on understanding how this phenomenon works, and on how to make it as useful as possible. There is little benefit to continuing experiments designed to offer proof, since there is little more to be offered to anyone who does not accept the current collection of data." End quote. This ends the key points of Dr. Jessica Utz's paper, so now we'll move on to the skeptic side. Review number 2, titled Evaluation of Program on Anomalous Mental Phenomena by Dr. Ray Hyman, September 11th, 1995. This paper is Hyman's direct response to Utz's conclusions. So, as a quick note, Hyman uses terms like anomalous cognition and anomalous mental phenomena, and so that you're not confused, anomalous mental phenomena is the whole range of psychic functioning, meaning extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. On the other hand, anomalous cognition specifically refers to extrasensory perception, which remote viewing falls under. Alright, the following is in the words of Dr. Hyman. Quote, "Because my report will emphasize points of disagreement between Professor Utz and me, I want to state that we agree on many other points. We both agree that the SAIC experiments were free of the methodological weaknesses that plagued the early SRI research. We also agree that the SAIC experiments appear to be free of the more obvious and better known flaws that can invalidate the results of parapsychological investigations. We agree that the effect sizes reported in the SAIC experiments are too large and consistent to be dismissed as statistical flukes. I also believe that Jessica Utz and I agree on what the next step should be. We disagree on key questions such as 1. Do these apparently non-chance effects justify concluding that the existence of anomalous cognition has been established? 2. Has the possibility of methodological flaws been completely eliminated? 3. Are the SAIC results consistent with the other contemporary findings in parapsychological laboratories on remote viewing and the Gonsfeld phenomenon? The remainder of this report will try to justify why I believe the answer to these 3 questions is no." End quote. The first key question is a direct challenge to Dr. Utz's conclusion that psychic functioning has been definitively proven. Dr. Hyman believes this isn't the case. Quote, "I agree with Jessica Utz that the effect sizes reported in the SAIC experiments and in the recent Gonsfeld studies probably cannot be dismissed as due to chance, nor do they appear to be accounted for by multiple testing, file drawer distortions, inappropriate statistical testing, or other misuse of statistical inference. Statistical effects by themselves do not justify claiming that anomalous cognition has been demonstrated. So I accept Professor Utz's assertion that the statistical results of the SAIC and other parapsychological experiments are far beyond what is expected by chance. Parapsychologists, of course, realize that the truth of this claim does not constitute proof of anomalous cognition. Numerous factors can produce significant statistical results. Operationally, the presence of anomalous cognition is detected by the elimination of all other possibilities. As the psychologist Edwin Boring once observed, every success in parapsychological research is a failure. By this, he meant that when the investigator or the critic succeed in finding a scientifically acceptable explanation for the significant effect, the claim for ESP, or anomalous cognition, has failed. Obviously, I do not believe that the contemporary findings of parapsychology, including those from the SRI/SAIC program, justify concluding that anomalous mental phenomena have been proven. Professor Utz and some parapsychologists believe otherwise. I admit the latest findings should make them optimistic. The case for psychic functioning seems better than it ever has been. The contemporary findings, along with the output of the SRI/SAIC program, do seem to indicate that something beyond odd statistical hiccups is taking place. I also have to admit that I do not have a ready explanation for these observed effects." End quote. So, that's a lot to take in, but basically, Dr. Hyman agrees that the results of the Stargate experiments went far beyond chance, luck, and statistical hiccups. He believes that there is a reasonable scientific explanation for it that is yet to be discovered, and admittedly, he has no idea what that might be, but he doesn't think it's psychic. That may sound biased, but there's no denying the logic that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as the famous Sagan standard goes. Alright, moving on to his second point that's very much related to the first. The first was that there could very well be another explanation for the reality of remote viewing other than psychic functioning. The second is that there could also be another explanation for the large and consistent statistical findings. Quote, "I do not agree that all possibilities for alternative explanations of the non-chance results have been eliminated. The SAIC experiments are well designed, and the investigators have taken pains to eliminate the known weaknesses in previous parapsychological research. In addition, I cannot provide suitable candidates for what flaws, if any, might be present. Just the same, it is impossible, in principle, to say that any particular experiment or experimental series is completely free from possible flaws. An experimenter cannot control for every possibility, especially for potential flaws that have not yet been discovered. At this point, a parapsychologist might protest that such in-principle arguments can always be raised against any findings, no matter how well conceived the study was from which they emerged. Such a response is understandable, but I believe my caution is reasonable in this particular case. Historically, many cases of evidence for psi were proffered on the grounds that they came from experiments of impeccable methodological design. Only subsequently, sometimes by fortunate accident, did the possibility of a serious flaw or alternative explanation of the results become available? End quote. Again, Hyman reflects the idea that extraordinary evidence is necessary because historically, scientific experiments of psychic functioning have either been seriously flawed or involved fraud, and he gives several historical examples of this. Finally, he tackles his third disagreement with Dr. Utz, that the SAIC results should not be compared to the Gonsfeld experiments. Quote, "The raison d'etre for the Gonsfeld experiments is the belief among some parapsychologists that an altered state facilitates picking up the psi signal because it lowers the noise-to-signal ratio from external sensory input. The touchstone of this protocol is the creation of an altered state in the receiver. This contrasts sharply with the remote viewing experiments, in which the viewer is always in a normal state. More important is that the Gonsfeld researchers believe they get the best results when each subject serves as his or her own judge. The reverse is true in the remote viewing experiments. The remote viewing experimenters believe that external judges provide much better hit rates than viewer judges. So, even if the Gonsfeld and the SAIC remote viewing experiments have achieved significant effects and average effect sizes of approximately the same magnitude, there is no compelling reason to assume they are dealing with the same phenomena." End quote. Dr. Hyman is right to say that the Stargate experiments and the Gonsfeld experiments are fundamentally different. Remote viewing is not the same as telepathy, and beyond that, the experiment protocols were vastly different, such as the sobriety of the subject. He then touches on the very important question of remote viewing's real utility for intelligence gathering operations. Quote, "If the scientific research confirms the existence of anomalous cognition, this does not guarantee that the ability would have useful applications. Approximately 20% of the information supplied by a viewer is accurate. Unfortunately, at the time the remote viewer is generating the information, we have no way of deciding which portion is likely to be the accurate one. Without any way to tell which statements of the viewers are reliable and which are not, the use of this information may make matters worse rather than better." End quote. Finally, Dr. Hyman gives his conclusion. Quote, "I have played the devil's advocate in this report. On the other hand, I want to state that I believe that the SAIC experiments, as well as the contemporary Gonsfeld experiments, display methodological and statistical sophistication well above previous parapsychological research. Despite better controls and careful use of statistical interference, the investigators seem to be getting significant results that do not appear to derive from the more obvious flaws of previous research. I have argued that this does not justify concluding that anomalous cognition has been demonstrated. However, it does suggest that it might be worthwhile to allocate some resources towards seeing whether these findings can be independently replicated. At this stage in the proceedings, the scientific community at large might be willing to acknowledge that an anomaly of some sort has been demonstrated." End quote. At this point, Dr. Utz and Dr. Hyman's individual reports were considered and evaluated by the rest of the panel, and this right here is the epic conclusion you all have been waiting for. I present to you the death of the Stargate Project. Quote, "We feel it is important to recognize that, in our opinion, both review papers are of exceptional quality. One of Dr. Hyman's first comments about Dr. Utz's review was that he considered it perhaps the best defense of parapsychological research he had come across. We concur. Likewise, we feel that Dr. Hyman's paper represents one of the clearest expressions of the skeptic position we have seen." End quote. After reviewing the points made by both Blue Ribbon experts, the panel goes on to give their final 4-point conclusion. Quote, "The laboratory research conducted as part of the present program has identified a statistically significant anomaly. However, the experiments have not provided a convincing demonstration that paranormal ability is involved. The research studies have not identified the nature and source of the effect. There is no evidence that the phenomenon would prove useful in intelligence gathering. The findings obtained in these studies actually argue against operational applications in the intelligence community. In the case of remote viewing, a large amount of irrelevant, erroneous information is provided and little agreement is observed among viewers' reports. It is unlikely that remote viewing, as currently understood, even if its existence can be unequivocally demonstrated, will prove of any use in intelligence gathering due to the conditions and constraints applying in intelligence operations and the suspected characteristics of the phenomenon. We conclude that continued support for the operational component of the current program is not justified." End quote. Based on the recommendations of this evaluation, in 1995, the CIA terminated the Stargate Project. So now, whenever you read an article or watch a video stating that sloppy methodology or expensive failures was a cause for the Stargate Project's downfall, shake your head and give a tisk, because you know better. It was the unreliable nature of these psychic phenomena, where in an active military operation, the difference between right and wrong information could mean life or death. However, the true and complete reason likely wasn't that simple. In fact, it was as enormously complex as the Stargate saga itself. The CIA was going through a bit of a rough patch where just 1 year before, in 1994, the CIA agent of 31 years of service, Aldrich Ames, was caught spying for the Soviet Union as a double agent, and was sentenced to life in prison by the Department of Justice for his betrayal, which had led to the death of a number of CIA agents. Worse yet, in the same year, the CIA and Department of Defense's horribly inhumane and highly illegal MKUltra project was brought back into the spotlight when the US General Accounting Office released a report stating that between 1940 and 1974, thousands of unsuspecting US and Canadian citizens were subjected to illegal human experiments involving psychedelic substances for the purposes of brainwashing, mind control, and psychological torture. All of this harks back to the fact that history tends to repeat itself. The first project officer of Stargate, Dr. Kenneth A. Kress, wrote the following in his 1977 report, in response to a period when the CIA had severed their involvement with SRI's remote viewing studies and the fate of the project seemed grim. Quote, "The agency, CIA, took the initiative by sponsoring serious parapsychological research, but circumstances, biases, and fear of ridicule prevented CIA from completing a scientific investigation of parapsychology and its relevance to national security. During this research period, the CIA was buffeted with investigations concerning illegalities and improprieties of all sorts. This situation, perhaps properly so, raised the sensitivity of CIA's involvement in unusual activities. The Proxmire effect, where the fear that certain government research contracts would be claimed to be ill-founded and held up for scorn, was another factor precluding CIA from sensitive areas of research. Parapsychological data, almost by definition, are elusive and unexplained. Add a history replete with proven frauds, and many people instantly reject the subject, saying, in effect, "I would not believe this stuff, even if it were true." End quote. Unfortunately, this sort of attitude carried forth after the closure of Stargate. In November of 1995, ABC News' Nightline interviewed the former CIA director, Robert Gates, who was active during the later years of Stargate. According to the show's transcript, which the CIA conveniently kept a copy of, Gates stated, quote, "All I can say is that in the 20 years or 25 years that I was perhaps in a position to be aware, I don't know of a single instance where it is documented that this kind of activity contributed in any significant way to a policy decision, or even to informing policymakers about important information. I think it's only fair to say that most intelligence professionals have been pretty skeptical of this. I think this is a pretty low priority for the intelligence community." End quote. If you read the whole interview, you might notice that Gates goes out of his way to avoid mentioning remote viewing by name, as if in denial that the project truly happened, or that the mere idea was really that embarrassing. But we've seen the data, so what's the real issue here? Was the Stargate Project even a failure? Perhaps this is the most important question we can ask, because the main goal from its beginning to end was to harness remote viewing as a reliable way to gather and validate intel. From the looks of the 1995 report, it might sound like a failure, explaining why exactly the CIA ended the program. But in a twist of things, the facts don't seem to reflect this. For whatever reason, the real military operations carried out at Fort Meade weren't factored into the CIA evaluation, but they definitely should have been. There's an obscure declassified briefing from 1984, written by the INSCOM Army Lieutenant Colonel Brian Bubsey, who led the program at Fort Meade during Stargate's Center Lane phase. Quote, "Overall, in the past 5 years, we have conducted more than 700 operational intelligence collection missions. A considerable portion of these, over 200, were in support of the Iran situation, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff rated as being qualitatively equal to those of other intelligence sources available to them. Over the past 5 years, INSCOM has conducted 100 collection projects for a number of different government agencies. Over 85% of our operational missions have produced accurate target information. Even more significant, approximately 50% of the 700 missions produced usable intelligence." End quote. That doesn't sound like a failure to me. In fact, it sounds like the CIA's original intention of remote viewing was achieved with astounding success. According to Joseph McMoneagle, nearly every government agency with an intelligence wing, including the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and even Customs, had employed Stargate remote viewers at some point in time. He also estimated that Stargate's total cost of $20 million was minuscule compared to its actual value, estimating that during the Persian Gulf War alone, which lasted just 1 year, remote viewers saved the government around $240 million by finding lost Scud missiles. Even the ABC Nightline host, Ted Koppel, outright stated in front of the former CIA director, quote, "I don't want to leave the suggestion that a great deal of money was spent. It was $20 million over 20 years, which in budgetary terms is peanuts." End quote. The truth is that despite the stigma, and despite any official denials, the Stargate Project was an obvious success. Scientifically, financially, and yes, even operationally. So, after literally months of researching this topic, my theory is that the real reason Stargate was cancelled was the stigma. One side being the relatively modern skepticism of the past 100 or so years that still gets psychic believers laughed at today and met with an uh-huh or yeah sure. But really, the stigma is far more complex than just that. In his 1996 article, Dr. Hal Pitoff discussed some of the most fundamental issues when it comes to presenting evidence of the paranormal. Quote, "We note that the overall efficacy of remote viewing in a program like this was not just a scientific issue. For example, when the Semipalatinsk data, Pat Price's remote viewing of the URDF-3 Soviet nuclear research site, was forwarded for analysis, one group declined to get involved because the whole concept was deemed unscientific nonsense, while a second group declined because, even though it might be real, it was possibly demonic." and a third group had to be found. And as in the case of public debate about such phenomena, the program's image was on occasion as likely to be damaged by an over-enthusiastic supporter as by a detractor. Personalities, politics, and personal biases were always factors to be dealt with. End quote. So, even if remote viewing was exactly what the CIA had been looking for, it was a never-ending frustration to argue for and convince others of its worth. So before the people in charge got fired for continuing to push something so absurdly ridiculous, they fired their psychic spies and supernatural soldiers. And as a bit of damage control, they pushed the idea that the CIA was in a weird place back then. But finally they snapped back to reality. No more MKUltra, no more Stargate. Of course, there is always the possibility that the CIA resumed or even continued in secret. After all, it's public knowledge what they did back then. At least some of it. But we have no clue what they're doing right now. That's top secret, my friends. So, what now? Well, you'll find that almost all who participated directly in the Stargate Project still passionately advocate for it. Dr. Edwin May went on to secure private research funding from the Portuguese pharmaceutical multimillionaire Dr. Luis Portela, and continues to forward the scientific study of remote viewing with a burning dedication to this day. Joseph McMoneagle, in his retirement, decided to put his remote viewing talent to good use, locating individuals who had been missing for decades. And by the publishing of his book, 2002, out of the 28 he'd been searching for, he'd successfully reunited 11 missing persons with their families. Ingo Swann, on the other hand, took a far more esoteric course, going on to work in the field of ufology, remote viewing secret extraterrestrial bases and even having a few close encounters with the third kind, which is definitely a story we'll be digging into in a future episode. Dr. Hal Pitoff continues to lead his scientific research organization, EarthTech International, as CEO and president. The US government is apparently one of EarthTech's most frequent clients, and maybe that fun fact speaks for itself. As for Russell Targ, his psychic investment firm Delphi Associates seemed to have a rather strong start, but it's not really clear how long Targ was involved, as a 2006 newsletter indicates that ownership was, at some point, transferred to the rather controversial Sean David Morton, who soon after would be convicted of civil securities fraud. On a brighter note though, in 2010, Targ released a full autobiography titled Do You See What I See? Memoirs of a Blind Biker, and you can bet that's on my reading list. By the way, I'd like to mention that something Russell Targ wrote ended up being one of the biggest reasons why I made these two videos in the first place. Quote, "As a scientist, my greatest wish was to tell the world that psychic abilities can sometimes produce data of almost architectural accuracy." End quote. So, in case he's watching this video, I hope I did a decent job with that. The CIA also has an after-story of their own, where in 2017, after losing a 3-year lawsuit waged by the non-profit news organization Muckrock, they were forced to declassify and release some 13 million pages of records to the public, today known as the Crest Archive. This data dump contains the vast majority of the Stargate documents available today, and is linked in the video description so you can check it out for yourself. Still, countless Stargate documents remain classified and details redacted, so we really do have to wonder what other secrets are left. Speaking of which, if you thought this was the end of our Stargate adventure, the last of our psychic spies, you'd be mistaken. We may have covered the history of the Stargate Project and the research performed in remote viewing, but that wasn't all they were involved in. Psychokinesis, astral projection, telepathy, and UFOs. In future episodes, we'll cover them all, but for now, you deserve a pat on the back. These two videos were pretty dense, and I seriously appreciate you watching to the very end. And if this investigation in any way changed, challenged, or validated your beliefs in psychic phenomena, please let me know in the comments. I'm super curious. Finally, if you're looking for another deep mystery, I think you'll really enjoy my Inner Earth Conspiracy Theory series, and right now I've got 3 episodes out with more coming soon, and you can watch them in any order. Huge thank you to my patrons. You all made this happen with your incredible support, and if you'd like to join in on helping me produce this type of content, I've got links in the description where you can make a one-time donation or support monthly if you wish. All proceeds go back to these videos. I'm Mr. Mythos. You guys are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.